And I think it's actually good that I didn't know about this data until I got into med school, because maybe I would have been tempted to play the victim card or to... All right, is it harder for white men to get into medical school here in the US? The reason I'm bringing this up is that yesterday I was at the gym and one of you guys, one of our subscribers, actually stopped by to say hi, which I love meeting you guys in person. It's always fun. And we got to talking about his med school application he's currently applying. So out of respect to his privacy, we're not going to be disclosing his name or any of these other details, but I will say that he is a Caucasian male and he has good numbers, good MCAT, good GPA, but he has no interview invites. And I want to talk about why I think that's the case. One thing he brought up is that it's harder being a white male, especially if you're not from a financially disadvantaged background, to get into med school. And I want to actually see, is that true or not? Because this is a common sentiment I've seen across, Reddit, other YouTube videos, that it is harder for white men to get into med school. So we'll dive into the data. I think the reason why this is a common sentiment is because on a larger societal scale, we're seeing this narrative that, the white man is the source of many problems and is overly privileged and yada, 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 which we're not going to get into that here. And that's not what this video is about. Whether you agree or disagree with that, cool. Not really the point. I am speculating that that larger societal narrative that, again, not everyone is saying this, but there are certain pockets of people who are. I think that is bleeding over into the assumption that it would make it harder for white men to get into med school. But let's quickly look at the data, because I want to talk about what I think is actually limiting this student's chances right now and why things aren't going as well as he had hoped. And also, I want to share the lessons I told him and the mindset shift that I think is actually going to help him a lot more moving forward. And I think it'll help many of you as well. So if we look at official AAMC data, and you look at the average MCAT and average GPA of matriculants, of people who actually got accepted and are matriculating to medical school based on ethnicity, you're going to see that the total MCAT score for white students is 512.12 based on the most recent year, 2024 to 2025. This is the latest data. And the GPA is a 3.81. So for Black or African American, we have 506.4 and GPA total of a 3.62. That is a big disparity there. If we look at Hispanic, Latino, or of Spanish origin, we see total MCAT of 505.9 and a GPA total of 3.65. And American Indian, I don't know why we call it American Indian, it's Native American, or Alaskan. By the way, I'm South Asian, I am Indian, like the actual India. I don't know why we need to keep perpetuating this whole Christopher Columbus was like, oh yeah, these are Indians, oops, he's mistaken, Native Americans. I don't know why we call them American Indians, but whatever. I think it just confuses everyone. So Native Americans or Native Alaskans, 503.3 for the MCAT and a 3.49 GPA. So looking at this, you'd be like, holy crap, white students need a much higher GPA and a much higher MCAT than these other groups. However, then you look at Asian, and Asian has a 513.9. That's 1.7 higher on the MCAT, and a GPA total of 3.84. That's 0.03 higher than white students. Based on this data, and if we're making the assumption that higher stats are harder to achieve, and therefore those students who are getting in with higher stats need to jump over a higher hurdle than those students who are getting in with lower stats, then actually white is clearly not the most challenging. Asian clearly would be. But let's look at some other data. If you look at the acceptance rates based on ethnicity, you're going to see Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander at 38.4%, the Native Alaskan or Native American at 50%, Black or African American at 35.9%, Hispanic or Latino at 43.4%. This is the acceptance rate of all the students in these ethnic groups who are applying to med school. And this is based on 2024 to 2025 data as well. Asian is 50.5%, so out of these groups, it is the highest so far, but white is actually 50.6%. Slightly higher, but I'm not sure if that's actually statistically significant or not, but it is the highest, and it is very close to Asian, much higher than these other groups. And now we're going to look at men versus women. Again, this is the most recent data. You can actually see all the way from 2018 to 2025. And what I found interesting here is that the GPA clusters a bit closer, and the MCAT has a little bit more of a gap. So in 2024 to 2025, men who matriculated to med school had an average total GPA of 3.78 versus women's 3.80. So women are a little bit higher on the GPA actually. But when you then explore the science versus non-science GPA, the men have a slightly higher science GPA of 3.74 versus 3.72 for women. And for the non-science, it's inverted. So women have an average of 3.89 and men have an average of 3.84. So for those who aren't familiar with med school admissions data, on average, you're going to have a lower science GPA versus a non-science GPA because science classes are harder, and at least for most students. But I think, not surprisingly, based on the relative strengths of men and women, men tend to have a slightly higher science GPA, women tend to have a slightly higher non-science GPA. And if you look to evolution and relative strengths of men and women, I don't think that's very surprising, but even saying that men and women are different is somehow a controversial thing to say these days. When you look at total MCAT, it is consistently higher for men who matriculate to med school versus women across all years from 2018 all the way to 2025. So most recently, men have a 512.6 and women have a 511.1. And when we dive deeper into these subsections on the MCAT, you're going to notice a similar pattern to what we saw with the GPA, which is that CARS and Psych-Soc, the two less hard sciences of the MCAT, the scores between men and women are almost identical, within 0.1 of each other. Whereas when you look at the harder sciences, the Chem Phys and the Biochem, you'll notice that men have a larger gap and they're scoring higher than women on average. And if you look at the total number of matriculants all the way back to 2018, you'll notice that men are actually matriculating in fewer numbers compared to women. Most recently, there were 10,261 men and 12,749 women. So every year now, you're actually seeing more women graduate med school than men. This has been happening for several years now. This is not a new phenomenon. And we know that women on average are excelling and doing far better than men when it comes to education currently. That's not just in medicine, that's across colleges and high schools and everything. All right, so based on that data, I do not see evidence that it is harder for white men to get into med school. However, this is a very pervasive narrative, and I remember visiting, if you guys saw my videos when I visited SGU, those were fun, spicy videos that you can find linked below. And I remember it was a female South Asian med student and a Caucasian male student, and they were both chatting with me, and the female South Asian student was telling me how it is so much harder for white men to get into med school than any other group. And I was sitting there just dumbfounded. We're like, wait a second, you're South Asian. It's actually, you're in the ethnic group that needs the highest MCAT and the highest GPA. But this narrative is so pervasive and so strong that even though she was part of that group, she didn't realize that her group needed the highest MCAT and highest GPA ethnically compared to any other ethnic group. Now, we don't have data that is actually stratified by both ethnicity and gender. So we have either gender or ethnicity data. We don't have them both at the same time. So since we can't stratify that, we can't talk about how easy or hard it is for a male Asian versus male Caucasian versus female Caucasian. We can just talk about either ethnic groups or gender, but not both at the same time with that same level of granularity that we would like. So going back to the student from the gym yesterday, I told him that based on the data I'm seeing at AAMC and also based on the experience of myself and our 250 plus doctors at Med School Insiders, because we are working with over 1,000 students every year, helping them get into med school and helping them get into residency and helping them with their MCAT tutoring and their USMLE tutoring. We see a lot of students, a lot of data, and we're not noticing any patterns that say it's harder for white men to get into med school. And I told him a story, which is that I wasn't aware of these data when I was applying to med school myself. And for those who don't know, I did well in college. I worked very hard. I had a personal reason to really want to become a doctor because I got diagnosed with a lifelong gut condition, and I got into many top med schools with scholarship, and in fact I didn't have to pay any tuition, and also most of my living expenses were covered based on merit. So based on my actual, not based on my ethnicity, not based on where I came from, not based on any of those things, just based on my hard numbers. My MCAT was equivalent to a 525, my GPA was a 3.95 when I applied. And I still remember the day I found out about this matriculation data and MCAT versus GPA across various ethnic groups. I was a second year med student and I attended a lunch talk by APAMSA, which is the Asian Pacific American Medical Student Association, just like another pre-med and med student group. And they were showing the data, and that was the first time I learned that Asian students, both South and East Asian, and I'm South Asian, I'm Indian, right, needed the highest MCAT and highest GPA of any ethnic group. And I was like, wait, what? Because it was more common knowledge that certain underrepresented groups needed a much lower MCAT and a much lower GPA that we already covered. But I had never heard that Asians needed a higher MCAT and a higher GPA than even Caucasians. It's like, wait a second, why is no one talking about this? This is so fascinating. And I think that's a whole nother discussion of culture and the Asian American mindset of you work your butt off and you put your head down. And it's kind of funny that some will say that Asians are doing well in America because they've assimilated more to American culture, which I don't agree with. I think it's because the Asian culture of, yeah, you work your butt off and you really apply yourself and etc. That's a whole nother discussion anyways that we don't need to get into right now. But it was shocking to me that this minority group in America needed higher stats than even Caucasians to get into med school, and yet no one was talking about it. And I think it's actually good that I didn't know about this data until I got into med school, because maybe I would have been tempted to play the victim card or to cope a little bit and say, hey, you know what? I'm part of the male South Asian group. It's too hard for me to get into med school. Maybe I shouldn't try as hard, or maybe I should make excuses when things don't go my way. You know what I mean? Because based on the data, we've identified that Asians need by far the highest MCAT and the highest GPA. And actually, if you look at prior years, there's actually been a much larger gap, almost a full GPA point between white and Asian. So it varies. Asian is always higher than white for GPA year to year. And I've actually seen it much higher than that, like closer to when I applied to med school. I think it was like 0.8. And then same with MCAT. We've already seen that it's close to 2 points, right? And then men versus women, men need a higher MCAT versus women. So if you are part of the male South Asian or East Asian group, then you are statistically at the greatest disadvantage in terms of needing the highest MCAT and highest GPA to get into med school. That's just the data. And again, we're not talking about what is right or wrong or whether that should or shouldn't be the case. That's not the point of this topic here. This is about you as a student right now, based on how you view the data and view the world. How does that influence your actions, your behavior, your belief about the system around you? And what I told this gentleman yesterday is that, first of all, I don't see that data. I don't think it is hardest for white men to get into med school. And we've confirmed that right now with official WMC data. But even if it was, actually, let's not even assume if it was. Let's just talk about the single group that does need the highest stats, which is the South Asian or East Asian males. Highest MCAT, highest GPA of any group, right? By focusing on that, by believing that, by using that as an excuse to explain why I may not have any interviews and it's October and I'm freaking out, does that serve you? I don't think so. And this gentleman was super open and super honest and super like, I loved his mindset, because he was like, no, it would just be a cope. I said, yeah, so if it's just a cope and it makes you feel better now, but it reduces your chances of achieving the goals that you want in the future, then why would you ever choose to believe it? You're trading a short-term feel good for a long-term harm yourself. So it doesn't really make logical sense, does it? And he agreed. So speaking with the student, we identified that, first of all, the application season is not over. I mean, you can still get interview invites. It has been a while since he submitted his secondaries, although he submitted his secondaries much later than he should have, and he acknowledged that. And he can still get into med school. He has strong stats, and I don't know about the soft components of his application. I think that is a very underemphasized part of the med school application process, because the reason we focus so much on GPA MCAT is because, number one, they're easy to measure. And number two, schools use that, because they're easy to measure, as a academic readiness score to see if you can handle the rigors of medical school. But if you have a terrible personal statement and terrible working activities and terrible secondaries, it doesn't matter if you have a perfect MCAT and GPA, you're not getting into med school. And if you also don't do well on your interview, again, all those other things, even if you have perfect essays and perfect scores, you bomb your interview, you don't get into med school. So again, we're working with incomplete information, but assuming that he has good enough soft components of his application, then his strong numbers can definitely help substantially, and he could still get into med school this cycle. However, he is at a substantial disadvantage by submitting both his primaries and secondaries behind schedule, and as you guys know with rolling admissions, applying early is really, really important. And I explained it this way. There is a spectrum to truth within these boundaries. So out here and out here, we acknowledge those are delusion. So I'm not going to say that the sky isn't blue. I'm not going to say that you can survive on just water and false hope or something. We understand that reality is within these bounds. But you can still argue a point within the spectrum, and it is your job to choose the point on that spectrum that actually serves you. So I told him the story of when I got sick with inflammatory bowel disease. I was 18 years old. I had just started college a couple months prior, and it was devastating. But in that spectrum of truth, I could choose to believe that, wow, this sucks. I now have a chronic digestive illness that is going to crush my future, all my future dreams and hopes and aspirations, and my life is going to suck, and I'm doomed, and poor me. And I'm going to win these victim Olympics that are becoming more and more common today on social media. It wasn't as common back then. But that's one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is, wow, this terrible thing happened to me, but I'm going to use this and sublimate it. That is a psychological term where you take something negative, turn it into positive. I'm going to sublimate it as my fuel to become the best doctor I can be. I'm going to be more disciplined. I'm going to work harder. I'm going to be more focused. It's going to help me not take things for granted, because now I understand how fragile health is, yada, yada, yada. I'm going to make this a positive thing that happened to me in my life. Which one do you think that I chose? Now, when you put it that way, it is so obvious which one you should be choosing. But when you're in the moment, it's a lot harder. And it's a lot more tempting to choose that self-victimizing mindset.
Oh no, poor me. I'm a white man and it's hard for me to get into med school.
First of all, no, it's not. It's actually a lot harder to get into med school if you're an Asian man, a South Asian or East Asian man. And yet, look at all the Asian men that get into med school, despite the odds, right? It is not set in stone. Statistics apply to populations, not to individuals. These are these t-shirts that I've been making for years for the Med School Insiders brand because that is such a core fundamental thing you need to know. Statistics apply to populations, not to individuals. So statistically, I was at a big disadvantage that I could not get into med school because, oh my god, I'm an Asian male and this is hopeless. Obviously not. There are Asian men that get into med school every single year. They just need higher MCAT and higher GPA than everyone else. Is that unfair? Yeah, it probably is, but I'm not going to change the system overnight. So I'm just going to work my butt off, get the highest MCAT I can get the highest GPA, and take agency and take ownership of my future. Simple as that. So again, in summary, choose the reality that actually serves you. When you take ownership, when you take responsibility, when you don't put it to an external locus of control, you take an internal locus of control, it allows you to learn, to adapt, and then to change your behavior. So the external locus of control here would be, oh my god, I'm a white male, it's harder for me to get into med school, life is hard, that's why I can't become a doctor. Even though there are white men that get into med school every year and become doctors every year, I just can't because the odds are stacked against me. Even though, by looking at the official data, clearly that's not the case, but I'm just going to be a victim and woe is me. Again, this is not what the student said, I'm just exaggerating for making the point here, okay? The internal locus of control, on the other hand, is, I don't have any interviews and it is now already the end of October. What can I do to improve my odds? Can I send any type of correspondence or application updates or LOIs to the schools I've applied to that I'm most interested in? If I don't get in this cycle, is there anything that I would have done differently next cycle, as in applying on time or maybe improving the quality of my essay responses on my personal statement or my work and activities or my secondaries? Would I work with professionals who actually have med school admissions committee experience, like the doctors at Med School Insiders? These are all the things that you would assume with an internal locus of control. So again, the truth is on a spectrum. We acknowledge that it's not out here. It's somewhere in here, but choose the reality that serves you.